My wedding day started with flowers. It ended with police lights. 6 months of planning. Sight. She said the tent violated a code. She said my joy was a nuisance. Then she made one call too many. What happened next? Nobody in Magnolia Ridge will ever forget. My name is Simone Carter, and I grew up in the house my parents still live in. A brick colonial on Willow Bend Court with a backyard my father built by hand. A stone patio. A pergola he wired with string lights. A garden my mother has tended for 22 years. It was always going to be where I got married. I'm 31. A pediatric nurse. Engaged to Andre Mitchell. A firefighter with the calmest hands I've ever known. We wanted something intimate. 80 guests. Folding chairs on the grass. My mother's peach cobbler on the dessert table. Nothing extravagant. Just family. The yard I grew up in. And a lot of love. Magnolia Ridge is the kind of subdivision that looks peaceful from the street. Matching mailboxes. Trimmed hedges. A welcome sign with a magnolia painted gold. My parents moved in 18 years ago. One of the first black families on the block. They kept their lawn immaculate, paid their dues on time, and mostly kept to themselves. The homeowners association ran the neighborhood like a small kingdom, and its queen was Deborah Whitfield, president for 11 straight years. Debbie, as everyone called her behind closed doors, measured grass height with an actual ruler. She had opinions about mailbox flags, holiday lights, and the acceptable shade of beige for shutters. I'd known Debbie my whole life the way you know a neighbor's dog that barks at everyone. Cautiously, from a distance. She'd smile at block parties and compliment my mother's tomatoes, but there was always a coolness underneath it. A way her eyes lingered a beat too long on our driveway. Our cars. Our guests. My father used to joke that Debbie kept a file on our house. He wasn't entirely wrong. Over the years she'd sent 3 letters about our fence stain, 2 about a basketball hoop, 1 about a loud gathering that turned out to be my 10th birthday party. Small things. Never quite enough to fight. Other neighbors got warnings too, but ours arrived faster, worded sharper. My mother stopped mentioning them at dinner because my father's jaw would tighten every time. Pick your battles, he always said. We picked ours. We trimmed the hedge an inch shorter. We kept the peace. When Andre proposed in the garden last spring, right where my mother's rose bushes climbed the trellis, I didn't think twice about hosting the wedding there. It felt like closing a circle, the same yard where I learned to ride a bike. Now the place I'd marry the man who made me feel like home. We booked the caterer, ordered the arch, hired a small 4-piece band. My mother started sewing table runners in April. My father, who doesn't cry, teared up measuring the aisle where he'd walk me. Everything felt golden, unstoppable, the way plans do before anyone tells you no. The HOA bylaws required a special event permit for gatherings over 50 guests. A rule almost nobody enforced and almost nobody knew existed. My mother found it buried on page 40 of a packet nobody reads. She filled it out anyway, thorough as always, and dropped it in the HOA mailbox herself in early June. Debbie's reply came within 48 hours, faster than any response the association had ever given my parents. It wasn't approval. Documentation, tent specs, guest count, vendor insurance. A noise ordinance acknowledgement. My mother sighed, gathered every document, and resubmitted within the week. I told myself it was just Debbie being Debbie, thorough to the point of exhausting. I didn't yet understand that thoroughness was her weapon, that she could bury a request in paperwork forever if she wanted to, that just following the rules was the softest, most respectable mask a certain kind of cruelty ever wore. What I didn't know then, what I'd only learned months later, was that Debbie had quietly circulated an email to select board members calling our wedding a potential liability, and not in keeping with the character of the neighborhood. She never sent that email to my parents. She never had to. Andre met Debbie for the first time at the mailbox in June, offered his hand, and introduced himself as my fiancé. She shook it, smiled thin as paper, and said, "So you're the one causing all this excitement." He laughed it off in the car. I didn't. A week later, my mother got a call from Pam Osei, one of the few neighbors who still liked us enough to talk straight. Pam said Debbie had been asking around the cul-de-sac about how many cars we expected, whether we'd hired outside security, and whether anyone had seen our vendor list. Nobody had asked her to ask. "She's building a case," Pam warned. "I don't know for what yet, but she's building something." I brushed it off as neighborhood gossip, the kind every subdivision has too much of. I had a wedding to plan and a mother of the bride dress to help pick out. I didn't have time to worry about Debbie Whitfield's clipboard. The first real spark came in July, when our tent company arrived to do a site measurement. They parked their van on the street for 20 minutes, hazards blinking, while two men walked our yard with a tape measure. Debbie appeared before they'd even finished, arms crossed, already holding her phone up like a badge. She told the tent crew they were in violation of parking rules and that she'd be documenting the visit. The foreman, a patient older man named Hector, explained they were only there for measurements, gone in minutes. Debbie photographed the van anyway, the license plate, both workers' faces, before they'd said another word. My mother came out to see what the commotion was, and Debbie turned the same camera toward her. "Just for the file," Debbie said, not lowering the phone. My mother, who has spent 18 years being polite to this woman, asked calmly what file that was. Debbie didn't answer. That night my parents got an email titled Notice of Concern, citing an unauthorized commercial vehicle on residential property and a pattern of unregistered visitors. My mother read it twice, then a third time, looking for the part that made sense. There wasn't one. Nothing at all. I called Debbie myself the next morning, determined to handle it woman to woman, professional and calm. She answered sweetly, almost warmly, and insisted it was nothing personal, just policy. When I asked which policy exactly banned a tent measurement, she said she'd have to check, and hung up before checking anything. Andre wanted to escalate, to go over her head to the HOA board directly. I asked him to wait. Foolishly maybe, that if we were reasonable enough, patient enough, documented enough, this would resolve itself the way every other small conflict in that neighborhood eventually had. I was wrong about that. The permit request sat under review for 3 more weeks. Every time my mother followed up, Debbie cited a new missing form, proof of liability insurance for the band, a fire marshal sign-off for string lights, a written guarantee that alcohol would be monitored by a licensed bartender. Each requirement appeared only after the last was met. Meanwhile, 2 other neighbors hosted a graduation party with a rented bounce house, 40 guests, and a DJ blasting until 11. No permit request was filed. No notice of concern appeared in their mailbox. I know because I drove past it myself, watching balloons bob over their fence. Feeling something cold settle in my stomach, I mentioned the double standard to my mother, careful with my words, not wanting to make her carry more weight than she already did. She just nodded slowly and said, "Baby, I've lived here 18 years. I already know." She'd known long before I let myself admit it. She'd just stopped expecting anything different. By August, Debbie had formed what she called a compliance subcommittee, herself, and 2 neighbors loyal to her, Carol and Rhonda, both of whom I'd never seen enforce a single rule before this summer. Their new job, apparently, was reviewing our wedding paperwork line by line, as if we were applying for a government contract. Andre's mother flew in from Ohio to help with planning and parked her rental car in our driveway for the week. Within a day, a photo of her car appeared taped to the community bulletin board with a red circle around the license plate and the words "Guest Vehicle, Report Violations HOA" printed above it. My father took the flyer down himself, hands shaking with an anger I'd rarely seen from him. He'd built that pergola with his own hands. He'd shoveled every neighbor's driveway during ice storms for a decade. And now his family was being treated like trespassers photographed and posted for the crime of hosting a wedding. I started keeping a folder of my own screenshots, emails, timestamps, not because I wanted a fight, but because some instinct told me I'd need proof one day that none of this was imagined. None of this was coincidence. None of this was really about tents or parking or paperwork at all. Pam Osei texted me a photo she'd taken by accident. A screenshot from an HOA group chat Debbie hadn't realized Pam was still in. In it, Debbie had written, "We need to be careful what precedent we set with these kinds of events." No one asked what these kinds of events meant. Nobody had to. I showed the screenshot to Andre that night, and for the first time since we got engaged, I saw real fear on his face. Not fear of Debbie exactly, but fear of what it might cost us to fight her. Fear that our wedding, the happiest day of our lives, was becoming something to survive. I almost called off the backyard wedding. I looked up venue rental prices, priced out a hotel ballroom 2 towns over, anything to avoid another notice of concern. My mother stopped me at the kitchen table, took both my hands, and said, "This is my yard, and you are my daughter, and we are not moving one flower." So we didn't move. My father printed every HOA bylaw and highlighted every rule Debbie had cited, cross-referencing each one against what she'd actually enforced for other families. The list of contradictions filled 4 pages. We stopped hoping she'd be reasonable and started preparing for the fight she clearly wanted. September brought the official denial letter, 3 weeks before the wedding date. The board has concerns regarding scale, noise, and safety, it read, signed by Debbie alone, though HOA bylaws required at least 2 board signatures for a permit denial. My mother noticed the missing signature immediately. It was our first real crack in her armor. We requested a formal board review, citing the missing second signature. Debbie stalled, claiming the treasurer, a soft-spoken woman named Linda Park, was unavailable for weeks. When I called Linda myself, she picked up on the second ring, very available, and visibly confused about why Debbie had told us otherwise. Linda agreed to review our file personally and asked us to send everything we had. That night I compiled the folder, every email, every flyer, every screenshot Pam had sent, and mailed it to her the next morning, feeling for the first time since June like someone in that neighborhood might actually be listening. Debbie must have sensed the shift, because her tactics changed overnight. Instead of paperwork, she started showing up. She walked past our house twice a day, always slow, always staring at whatever was set up in the yard, the rented arch, the folding chairs stacked against the garage, my mother's borrowed china. One afternoon she rang the doorbell and handed my mother a laminated copy of the noise ordinance, underlined in 3 colors. "Just so there's no confusion," she said, smiling the whole time. My mother thanked her politely and closed the door, then stood in the hallway for a long moment before she started laughing, disbelieving. Andre's firehouse crew heard about what was happening and half-joked about showing up in uniform for moral support. I told him not to. Not yet. I didn't want this to look like intimidation on our side too. Didn't want to give Debbie anything that could be twisted into a story about us being the aggressors. Carol, one of Debbie's subcommittee allies, cornered my mother at the mailbox one morning and asked, with saccharine concern, whether we'd considered a smaller guest list. For everyone's comfort. My mother asked whose comfort exactly was being discussed. Carol didn't have an answer. She just adjusted her sunglasses and walked briskly away. I found out later that Debbie had also called our caterer directly, introducing herself as HOA leadership and asking pointed questions about generator noise and grease disposal. Questions with no real answers. Questions designed only to make the caterer nervous enough to reconsider the booking. He called me confused, asking if there was a problem. I reassured him there wasn't, that the HOA had no authority over his business whatsoever, and thanked him for the heads up. He stayed on for the job, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. The small doubt Debbie had planted with a single unnecessary phone call to a total stranger. By late September, the neighborhood had quietly split into 2 camps. Some neighbors, like Pam and Mr. Okafor next door, brought over casserole dishes and offers to help set up chairs. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if proximity to our wedding might get their own names added to Debbie's mysterious file. Mr. A retired engineering professor who'd lived on the block even longer than Debbie, pulled my father aside one evening and told him quietly that Debbie had tried something similar with the Vasquez family years earlier, over a quinceañera. She backed off that time, he said. I don't know why. Why she won't now. That detail stuck with me. If Debbie had let a quinceañera happen, loud music and all, why was our wedding suddenly the greatest threat Magnolia Ridge had ever faced? I didn't say the word out loud yet, not even to Andre, but the shape of it was already sitting heavy in my chest. Linda Park called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice careful. She'd reviewed our folder and found the denial procedurally improper, missing the required second signature and citing no bylaw that actually restricted backyard weddings. She promised to bring it to the full board at the next meeting, scheduled 2 weeks before our wedding date. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. Andre and I allowed ourselves a quiet dinner where we talked about nothing but flower arrangements and first dance songs, pretending, just for one evening, that we were an ordinary couple with an ordinary wedding and nothing more complicated than that. Debbie must have heard about Linda's review, because 2 days later a new flyer appeared on the community board, and signed this time, warning residents about unauthorized commercial activity and safety hazards tied to an unnamed upcoming event. Everyone on the street knew exactly whose event it meant. Nobody needed a name attached. My mother tore that flyer down herself, calm as ever, and posted a polite notice beside the mailboxes correcting every false claim it made, citing our approved vendor insurance and permit paperwork. Within an hour, her notice was gone too, and Debbie's flyer was back up, laminated this time, as if daring anyone to remove it again. The board meeting finally arrived, held in the clubhouse's small beige conference room under fluorescent lights. Debbie sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over her own courtroom, flanked by Carol and Rhonda. My parents and I sat across from them, folder in hand, ready to make our case. Linda opened by stating plainly that the denial lacked a required second signature and cited no specific bylaw violation. Debbie interrupted twice, insisting the spirit of the rules mattered more than technicalities. A phrase that made my father's eyebrows lift so high I thought they might leave his face entirely. A third board member, a quiet man named Frank who rarely spoke at meetings, asked Debbie directly why the Vasquez quinceanera years earlier had never received a denial letter despite a similar guest count. Debbie's smile flickered, just barely, before she claimed she didn't recall the specifics of an event she had personally attended. The room went quiet in a way that felt like it meant something. Frank didn't push further, but he didn't need to. My mother caught my eye across the table, and I understood without a word passing between us that everyone in that room had just watched the same crack appear in the same story. The board voted 3-2 to overturn the denial, granting our permit with standard noise and parking conditions attached. The same conditions applied to every other approved event that year. Debbie voted against it, of course, and left the meeting without a word, her chair scraping loud against the linoleum floor. I should have felt triumphant walking to the car that night. Instead, I felt uneasy, the way you feel watching a storm cloud pass overhead instead of through you. Grateful, but not naive enough to think it was finished. Debbie didn't strike me as a woman who lost gracefully, or quietly, or once. For a week, things went strangely calm. No flyers. No slow, staring walks past our yard. My mother allowed herself to believe it was over, and started humming while she ironed the table runners. And I let myself believe it too, because believing anything else felt exhausting beyond what I had left. Andre's firehouse threw him a small engagement toast, and for one evening we didn't talk about the HOA at all, just guest lists, just his nervous best man speech draft, just the ordinary sweetness of two people getting ready to build a life together, undisturbed by anyone's clipboard or camera phone. My mother finished the last table runner on a Sunday afternoon, 12 of them stacked neat on the dining table, hand-stitched with tiny magnolias in the corners. A quiet echo of the neighborhood's name and everything it was supposed to mean but hadn't. Not for us. Not for a long time now. I drove past Debbie's house once that week, on my way to pick up centerpiece vases, and saw her standing in her own front yard, arms crossed, watching our house from across the cul-de-sac the way a hawk watches a field before it decides whether or not it's hungry enough to dive. I didn't mention it to my parents. I didn't want to hand them one more thing to worry about when they'd already carried so much quietly, so gracefully, for so many years in that neighborhood. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the calm was simply calm, and nothing more sinister underneath it. 2 weeks before the wedding, the tent company called to confirm the final delivery date. Everything on their end was set, insurance filed, permit number logged, delivery scheduled for the morning of the ceremony. Hector, the foreman, joked that this was the smoothest booking he'd had all season. I laughed and didn't correct him. My mother ordered the flowers, deep burgundy dahlias and eucalyptus, from a florist 2 towns over who'd done Pam's daughter's wedding the previous spring. Pam vouched for her personally, and for the first time in months, something about the wedding felt like it belonged only to us again, untouched by anyone else's agenda. Andre's mother flew back into town for the final week, this time parking on the street with a printed permit taped inside her windshield, just in case. Felt absurd. Laminating proof of innocence before anyone had even accused us of anything. But by then we'd all learned not to leave a single gap open. I tried on my dress for the final fitting. Ivory silk with a low back. My grandmother's pearl earrings tucked into the bodice pocket for the ceremony. My mother cried a little, the good kind of crying, and for 20 whole minutes in that fitting room, Debbie Whitfield did not exist in my mind at all. 10 days out, Linda Park called again, this time just to check in. No board business attached. She told me quietly that Debbie had requested additional patrol presence from the local police non-emergency line for the weekend of the wedding, citing past disturbances in the neighborhood. There had never been a single disturbance. Not one. I felt the calm I'd been holding on to for 2 weeks start to crack right down the middle. Andre wanted to call the police department directly to ask what exactly Debbie had reported. I told him to wait, to let it go through official channels, still clinging to some belief that reasonable people would see through this. My father, who rarely raised his voice about anything, called the non-emergency line himself and asked plainly what past disturbances the request referenced. The dispatcher, apologetic but unable to share details, said only that a resident had filed a proactive concern about an unpermitted large gathering. Our permit number was on file. She read it back to him herself. That contradiction, an official proactive concern about an event the HOA's own board had already approved, became the second item in my growing folder.
Sitting now beside the missing signature, the quinceanera double standard, and the group chat screenshot Pam had never meant for me to see in the first place.
Mr. by that evening with a bag of oranges from his tree, unprompted, and told my father quietly that he'd overheard Debbie on her porch phone call mention, making sure someone's watching that weekend. He hadn't caught the rest, but he wanted us to know, in case it mattered later. It did. My mother didn't cry over any of this. Not once. Not that I ever saw. She just kept sewing, kept baking, kept ironing linens with a steadiness that made me ashamed of how frightened I'd let myself become. We've survived worse than a woman with a clipboard, she told me. We will survive her too. I started to understand, slowly, painfully, that this had never really been about tents or parking or noise ordinances at all. It was about a black family building something beautiful in a yard Debbie had quietly decided didn't belong to people who looked like us, no matter how many years we'd already lived there. Andre proposed we hire a wedding coordinator for the day itself, someone neutral who could handle logistics and, if needed, handle Debbie, so neither of us would have to spend our wedding day managing a woman determined to ruin it. We found one through the caterer, a sharp, unflappable woman named Renata. Renata read through our entire folder in one sitting and didn't blink. "I've dealt with HOA presidents before," she said simply. "Give me the permit number, give me your board approval email, and let me handle whoever shows up at that gate." For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The week before the wedding felt almost gentle. Guests started confirming travel. Cousins from Charlotte. Andre's grandmother flying in from Detroit despite her bad hip because she refused to miss this. The yard slowly filled with rented chairs stacked under a tarp. The arch frame assembled early, draped in plastic against the rain. My mother and I spent one whole afternoon just arranging fake seating charts on the kitchen table, laughing over which cousins absolutely could not sit near each other. The ordinary chaos of wedding planning finally, blessedly, taking up more space in my head than Debbie Whitfield had managed to claim in months. Pam brought over a bottle of wine on Thursday night and toasted to the last quiet weekend before the storm. Meaning the happy kind of storm, the family descending on your house kind. We laughed about it then. None of us yet knew how literally the word storm would end up applying to what was coming. Andre and I drove to the courthouse Friday morning just to pick up our marriage license. Quiet, ordinary errand that felt strangely emotional. Standing in that fluorescent-lit government office holding hands. Two names about to become one certificate. One Saturday away from everything we'd spent a summer fighting to protect. Friday evening. The tent crew arrived to set the frame early. Per Renata's careful scheduling. Permit copy taped to the truck's dashboard where anyone could see it. Hector waved at my father like an old friend now. The frame went up smooth and fast. No interruptions. No cameras. No laminated warnings taped anywhere. My mother's rosebushes were in full bloom along the trellis. Timed almost perfectly, as if the yard itself had decided to cooperate after a summer of chaos. String lights went up along the pergola my father built years ago. And for a moment, standing in that half-finished setup, finally looked like a wedding. Andre's grandmother arrived Friday night, moving slow but bright-eyed, and hugged my mother like they'd known each other for decades instead of months. She sat on the back patio for an hour just watching the lights flicker on, and said quietly, "This yard has good bones, baby. Good bones hold a family up." We had a small rehearsal dinner Friday evening, just close family, at a restaurant 2 towns over, deliberately far from Magnolia Ridge. Toasts were happy, a little tearful, entirely ordinary. Andre's best man told an embarrassing story about a middle school fire drill. Nobody mentioned the HOA once. Felt like a small miracle. I went to bed that night almost able to convince myself the fight was over, that Debbie's petty campaign had exhausted itself against a board vote and a permit number and 11 years of a family's quiet dignity finally being taken seriously by someone other than themselves. I should have known better by then. Saturday morning began exactly the way a wedding morning should. My mother in the kitchen before sunrise. Coffee brewing. The smell of her famous cinnamon rolls filling the house. My hairstylist arrived at 7. Bridesmaids trickled in with garment bags and mimosas. For 2 golden hours, Nothing existed outside that house. Outside, the tent crew finished the final draping by 8. Chairs arranged in careful rows facing the trellis. A narrow grass aisle marked with white ribbon. My father had staked himself that morning, kneeling in the dew in his good shoes because he refused to wait for anyone else to do it. Renata arrived at 9 sharp, clipboard in hand, permit copy and board approval email printed and laminated, tucked into a folder she wore like armor. She walked the property line twice, checked every stake against the property survey, and told my mother flatly, "Nobody's finding a single loose thread in this setup today." Guests began arriving around 11 for the 1 o'clock ceremony. Cars lining the street in the exact zones our approved parking plan designated. Cones set out precisely where the permit specified. Andre's firehouse crew showed up in plain clothes. Off duty. Just guests today. Though I noticed a few of them glance toward Debbie's house anyway. I stood at my bedroom window around noon, already half in my dress, watching the yard fill with people who loved us. String lights glowing faint against the bright autumn sky. And for one full, unguarded minute, I let myself believe the hardest part of this whole journey was finally, completely behind us. Debbie's house sat quiet all morning. Curtains drawn. No movement on her porch. And Pam texted me at noon that she'd seen Debbie's car still in the driveway, unmoved since the night before. "Maybe she's finally letting it go," Pam wrote. I wanted so badly to believe that. I let myself want it anyway. At 12:30, my father knocked on my door in his suit, eyes already wet, and told me it was almost time. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. My grandmother's earrings, my mother's veil from decades earlier, altered just slightly for me, and felt, finally, entirely, unmistakably happy. The band started tuning around 12:40. Soft instrumental warm-ups drifting through the open windows. Guests settled into their seats, fanning themselves with the paper programs Andre's sister had designed. Little magnolias printed in the corner. A small tribute to the neighborhood that had made this so much harder than it should have been. At 12:50, Renata did one final perimeter walk, checking noise levels against the ordinance, checking the guest count against our permit cap, checking every last detail with the focus of someone who understood exactly what kind of afternoon this family had already survived just to reach this ordinary, beautiful moment. I stood in the hallway with my father, his arm looped through mine, both of us breathing slow and deliberate, listening to the band shift into the processional. Through the window I could see Andre already standing at the trellis, hands clasped, grinning the way he grinned the day he proposed. Nothing else mattered. What none of us knew, in that golden hallway moment, was that Debbie had spent the entire quiet morning inside her house not letting anything go at all, but composing something else entirely, a written statement, timestamps included, preparing to call in a complaint the second the ceremony music began to play. She'd been documenting from her bedroom window with a zoom lens for over an hour, cataloging guest arrivals, car makes, plate numbers, anything that might read as suspicious to someone who'd already decided what conclusion she wanted to reach before she'd gathered a single piece of actual evidence. At 12:58, 2 minutes before I was set to walk down that ribbon-marked aisle, Debbie picked up her phone, dialed the non-emergency police line, and reported what she called a large unauthorized gathering with a hostile crowd at our address, adding, unprompted, that she feared for her safety as a lone woman nearby. She said this with no evidence. No incident. No hostility of any kind occurring anywhere on that property. Only 80 guests in their Saturday best. A 4-piece band. And a bride standing in a hallway with her father. Completely unaware that a false report was already moving through dispatch toward her wedding. The processional music swelled. My father squeezed my arm. We stepped through the back door into the sunlight, and every single face in that yard turned toward me at once. And for those first few steps down the aisle, I felt nothing but pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind I'd fought all summer to protect. I made it halfway down the aisle, past Pam dabbing her eyes, past Andre's grandmother beaming from her folding chair, before I heard it, faint at first, then unmistakable, the low approaching whine of sirens. More than one, growing louder against the quiet autumn afternoon, closing in fast on Willow Bend Court. Andre's eyes found mine across the aisle, confusion flickering where joy had been a second earlier. The officiant paused mid-sentence. Heads began turning toward the street instead of the trellis. My father's grip on my arm tightened, not in fear exactly, but in the specific, weary readiness of a man who'd expected this all along. 3 patrol cars turned onto Willow Bend Court, lights flashing but sirens now cutting off, rolling slow toward our address like they weren't entirely sure what they were about to find. Guests half rose from their folding chairs. The band's music faltered and stopped mid-measure, instruments lowering one by one into confused silence. Renata moved before anyone else did, clipboard already open, striding toward the street with the calm, fast purpose of someone who had genuinely prepared for exactly this moment. I stood frozen at the halfway point of my own wedding aisle, my father's hand still locked around my arm, my heart slamming against my ribs. For officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands not on weapons but faces alert, scanning the yard full of people in wedding clothes with an expression that read, even from a distance, as visibly uncertain about what kind of hostile gathering they'd actually been called to respond to on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Debbie emerged from her own front yard almost immediately, phone still in hand, walking briskly toward the officers with the confident stride of a woman who believed, completely, that she was about to be vindicated in front of the entire neighborhood watching from their porches and windows up and down the street. Officers, thank you for coming so quickly, she said, loud enough for half the block to hear. This has been going on for months, unauthorized gatherings, no permits, and frankly I felt unsafe in my own home. She gestured toward our yard like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom she'd built herself. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, held up a hand and asked her to slow down, asked for specifics, what exactly had happened, when, what safety concern precisely. Debbie hesitated for the first time all summer, visibly searching for an answer more concrete than the vague dread she'd been peddling for weeks. Renata reached them at that exact moment, folder already open, and calmly introduced herself as the event coordinator. This wedding is fully permitted through the Magnolia Ridge HOA, she said, holding out the laminated approval email. The board vote minutes, the parking plan, the noise ordinance compliance sheet, everything, all of it, ready. The officer took the folder and read it slowly while Debbie talked faster and faster beside him, insisting the permit was under dispute, that the board had been misled, that she had documentation of her own she'd be happy to provide. The officer glanced up at her, then back down at the clearly dated board approval. I stood at the edge of the aisle now, dress bunched slightly in my fist, watching a woman try to unmarry a decision 3 board members had made weeks earlier in a beige conference room, watching her do it in front of my grandmother, my bridesmaids, my father, and 80 guests in their Saturday best. "Ma'am," the officer said, not unkindly but firmly, "this permit is valid and dated, signed by 2 board members as required. There's no ordinance violation here. Can you tell me specifically what safety threat prompted this call?" Debbie opened her mouth, closed it, and for one long moment, said absolutely nothing at all. It's a large crowd," she finally managed. "I don't know all these people. I don't know their intentions." The officer's expression shifted, something between professional patience and quiet disbelief, as he looked past her at 80 people frozen mid-ceremony in wedding clothes, holding programs, one man still clutching a trombone. A second officer, younger, walked the perimeter briefly, taking in the folding chairs, the trellis, the string lights, the clearly staged wedding party, and returned shaking his head slightly at his partner in a way that needed no translation. There was no hostile crowd here. There was only a wedding, interrupted mid-vow. My mother appeared at my side then, having crossed the yard the moment the sirens hit, and stood beside me facing the officers directly, calm in a way that only 18 years of practiced restraint could produce. "Officers," she said clearly, "this is my home. This is my daughter's wedding. We have every permit required." The lead officer nodded slowly, folder still in hand, and turned back to Debbie. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from the property line. Based on what I'm seeing, this call doesn't match a valid safety concern, and continued interference here could rise to disorderly conduct on your part, not theirs." Debbie's face went through something complicated, disbelief, then indignation, then a flicker of something almost like panic, as if the script she'd rehearsed for months had never once accounted for the possibility that the police might not simply take her word as fact the moment she said it out loud. "You don't understand," she said, voice rising now, pitch climbing toward something desperate. "I've documented this for months. I have photos. This family has been a problem since they moved in." The word problem landed heavy in the sudden quiet, hanging over the yard like smoke that wouldn't clear. A murmur moved through the guests, low and disbelieving, and I saw Andre's grandmother's hand fly to her mouth. My father's jaw tightened beside me, but he said nothing yet, watching, waiting, the same patient watchfulness that had carried him through 18 years of letters and fines and flyers taped up around the block. The lead officer's tone sharpened slightly. "Ma'am, that's not relevant to this call. What I'm seeing is a legally permitted private event and a resident making a report that doesn't match the scene in front of me. I'd strongly advise you return to your own property before this becomes something you're cited for." Debbie didn't move. Back up, scrolling frantically, insisting she had proof, turning the screen toward the officer to show photos she'd apparently taken all summer, our tent crew, Andre's mother's rental car, the flyer she'd laminated, presented now like exhibits in a trial only she believed was happening. The officer glanced at the photos for exactly 3 seconds before handing the phone back. None of this shows a crime, ma'am. It shows a family planning a wedding. Something in his flat, tired delivery made one of the guests near the back let out a short, involuntary laugh, quickly smothered behind a hand. I felt Andre's hand find mine then, having crossed the yard himself, still in his suit, standing beside me now instead of waiting at the trellis. "You okay?" he whispered. I wasn't, not entirely, but I nodded anyway, because I needed to be, because 80 people were watching to see what we'd do next. My mother stepped forward once more, voice steady, and addressed the officers directly. "For the record, I'd like this call documented as a false report. We have 18 years of similar incidents from this same resident, and I intend to file a formal complaint with the HOA board and this department both." The lead officer nodded, already writing, and confirmed the incident number would reflect exactly that. An unfounded call. No violation found on our end. Resident advised to cease further reports absent verifiable cause. Debbie stood frozen at the edge of her own lawn, phone still clutched in her hand, saying nothing now at all. It was Mr. Silence, stepping out from his own yard where he'd been watching the entire exchange, walking slowly toward the officers with the unhurried authority of a man who'd lived on that street longer than the HOA itself had existed in its current form. "I have something to add," he said. He told the officers, calmly and without embellishment, about the quinceanera years earlier, the one Debbie had attended, danced at even, and never once filed a report about, despite a guest count larger than ours and music that ran 2 hours past what our own noise ordinance permitted that afternoon. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," he said carefully, "but I think it's worth someone asking why this family's wedding warranted a police call and that one didn't." The lead officer wrote that down too. Expression unreadable, though I noticed his eyes flick toward Debbie one more time before he closed his notebook. Pam stepped forward next, unprompted, phone already in hand, and quietly showed the officer the group chat screenshot she'd never meant to send me in the first place. Debbie's own words. "We need to be careful what precedent we set with these kinds of events," dated months before any permit had even been filed. The officer studied the screenshot for a long moment, then looked up at Debbie with an expression that had shifted entirely now. Professional courtesy giving way to something colder, more measured. "Ma'am, I think it's best you head inside. We'll be following up on this separately from today's call." Debbie's mouth opened again. Some protest half-formed, but nothing came out that made sense anymore. She looked, for the first time all summer, genuinely small standing there on her own lawn, phone useless in her hand, the entire street watching a version of her that her laminated flyers had never quite managed to hide. I don't know exactly what made me speak up then, except that I was tired, and it was my wedding, and 80 people who loved me were still standing in a half-finished ceremony waiting to see what would happen. "Officers," I said, "thank you. Would it be all right if we continued the ceremony now?" The lead officer's face softened for the first time since he'd stepped out of his car, and he looked around at the trellis, the folding chairs, the trombone player still holding his instrument at his side. "Ma'am," he said to me, "I think that's a wonderful idea. We'll clear out and let you get married." But he didn't leave immediately. Instead he turned to his partner and said something quiet I couldn't quite hear, and the two younger officers exchanged a look. And then, to my complete astonishment, all four of them began walking toward the folding chairs instead of toward their cars, taking off their hats as they came. "If it's all right with the family," the lead officer said, almost sheepish now, "we'd like to stay for just a minute." From the back, "Out of respect. We don't get called out to many weddings. Figured this one deserves a proper send-off, given the mourning it's had." My mother's eyes filled instantly with tears. My father, who I had never once seen cry in 31 years, pressed the back of his hand hard against his eyes and nodded at the officer, unable to speak for a moment, before finally managing a rough, grateful, "Thank you, officer." Truly, nodded back, quiet, and took a seat in the last row. The band, after a stunned pause, lifted their instruments again, and the officiant, visibly moved, cleared his throat and asked if we were ready to begin once more. I looked at Andre across the aisle, tears now streaking both our faces, and nodded, because yes, God, yes, we were more than ready. Debbie was still standing at the edge of her lawn as the processional music restarted, phone hanging useless at her side, watching for uniformed officers remove their hats and sit quietly among our guests instead of clearing the property the way she'd so clearly imagined this entire confrontation would end for us. Not her. I walked the second half of that aisle with my father, past my mother now seated again with tears streaming freely, past Pam and Mr. Okafor and Andre's grandmother, past four strangers in uniform who'd chosen, in the space of 10 minutes, to become something more than the instrument Debbie had tried to weaponize against us. Andre took my hands at the trellis, both of us laughing and crying at once, and the officiant, voice a little unsteady himself now, said, "I don't think I've ever started a ceremony with quite this much drama behind me, but I also don't think I've ever seen a braver bride. Let's get you married." We said our vows under string lights and October sunshine, surrounded by everyone who mattered, while 3 squad cars sat quietly parked along the curb and Debbie Whitfield stood alone on her own front lawn, watching a wedding proceed exactly the way it was always supposed to, despite every single thing she'd tried. What none of us knew yet, standing in that yard exchanging rings, was that Debbie's mourning was about to get significantly worse, because Linda Park, the HOA treasurer, had been watching the entire confrontation unfold from her own driveway 2 houses down, phone already recording every word of it from the start. Linda had been suspicious of Debbie for longer than any of us realized. Not about weddings, but about money, small discrepancies in the HOA's dues ledger that had bothered her for over a year. Entries she couldn't quite reconcile no matter how many times she reviewed the quarterly statements Debbie always insisted on filing herself. Linda had quietly requested a full financial audit from the HOA's management company back in August, right around the time Debbie's campaign against our wedding was reaching its peak. Though at the time Linda hadn't yet connected the two, hadn't yet understood how deeply threatened Debbie might feel by any kind of scrutiny at all. The audit results landed in Linda's inbox that very Saturday morning, delivered by an automated system with no sense of timing whatsoever, just as the sirens were pulling onto Willow Bend Court. Linda read the first page standing in her driveway, then read it again, then started recording the scene unfolding across the street. The audit found nearly $6,000 in HOA landscaping and administrative funds routed over 3 years to invoices Debbie herself had approved for vendors that, on closer inspection, didn't appear to exist under any registered business name in the state. Linda hadn't planned to reveal this today. Today revealed itself. As the ceremony continued in our yard, Linda quietly forwarded the audit findings to the entire HOA board, along with the video she'd just recorded of Debbie's confrontation with police, and a short note, "I think we need an emergency meeting. I think we need it soon. I think everyone needs to see both of these." By the time Andre and I finished our vows and turned to face our applauding guests, married now, genuinely married, 3 board members had already replied to Linda's email, and one of them, Frank, had replied with a single line, "Emergency session tomorrow morning. All members. Week." We didn't know any of this yet. Not in that moment. In that moment, all I knew was Andre's hand in mine, the smell of my mother's roses, the sound of 80 people cheering, and somewhere behind it all, faint and distant, the quiet click of consequences finally beginning to catch up to Debbie Whitfield. The reception moved forward under the tent as the sun dipped lower, string lights glowing warm against the early evening, and for a few hours it felt like nothing else in the world existed except dancing, toasts, and my father spinning me around the grass to a song I'd chosen for exactly this moment. Debbie's house stayed dark and silent through all of it, curtains drawn tight, no movement at all, though more than one guest admitted later they'd glanced over more than once, half expecting another siren, another flyer, another chapter in a summer none of us would ever fully be able to explain to strangers. Around 9 that evening, as the last slow song played and guests began drifting toward their cars with plates of leftover cake wrapped in napkins, Pam pulled me aside near the gate and told me, quietly, that she'd heard from Linda. An emergency board meeting had been called for the very next morning. I felt a strange mix of things hearing that. Exhaustion, mostly, but underneath it something close to vindication. The sense that the folder I'd been building all summer, the screenshots and timestamps and missing signatures, had finally found its way into hands that might actually do something with all of it. Andre and I left for our one-night honeymoon suite 2 hours away just after 11. Exhausted and glowing, deliberately avoiding any further thought of Debbie Whitfield until at least the following afternoon. My parents stayed behind to help break down the tent, refusing, even then, to let anyone else clean up their own daughter's wedding. What none of us witnessed directly, but pieced together later from neighbors' accounts, was that Debbie spent that Saturday night composing a lengthy email to the entire HOA distribution list, defending her actions, insisting the police call had been a reasonable precaution, and accusing Linda of overstepping her role with the audit request. She sent it at 11:47 that night, copying every resident on the HOA email list, apparently unaware or unwilling to accept that Linda's own findings and video had already reached 3 board members hours earlier, and that her lengthy defense was arriving not as a preemptive strike but as a very late, very public confession. Rhonda, one of Debbie's closest allies on the subcommittee, replied to the group email at 6 a.m. Sunday with a single line, "Debbie, I think you need to sit this meeting out and let the board handle it clean." Even her staunchest supporter seemed could read the room once the room had actual evidence in it. Carol, the other ally, didn't reply to the email at all, but she did call Linda directly Sunday morning, according to what Linda told me weeks later, asking nervously whether the audit findings could implicate anyone besides Debbie. Linda assured her it could not, and Carol's relief was, by her own admission, deeply obvious. The emergency board meeting convened at 10 Sunday morning in the same beige conference room where our permit had been overturned weeks earlier, though this time every seat was filled, and several residents who weren't even board members showed up anyway, having heard enough hallway whispers to know something significant was happening. My father attended on our behalf, since Andre and I were still an hour away, sipping coffee in a hotel room, blissfully unaware for a few more hours of exactly how thoroughly the ground was shifting beneath the woman who had spent an entire summer trying to make our wedding day into her personal battlefield. Linda opened the meeting by playing her recording from Saturday afternoon, Debbie's raised voice, the officer's calm rebuttals, the moment she called our family a problem, the moment Mr. Okafor mentioned the quinceañera, the moment 4 officers chose to sit quietly in our folding chairs instead of clearing our lawn. The room, my father told us later, was dead silent through the entire 6-minute clip. Nobody moving, nobody whispering, just the sound of Debbie's own voice playing back to a room full of people who had spent 11 years assuming she was simply strict, simply thorough, simply difficult, never quite this. Then Linda pulled up the audit, walking the board line by line through 3 years of invoices tied to vendors nobody could verify, landscaping charges for services neighbors confirmed had never actually been performed, funds that traced back, every single time, to accounts Debbie alone had access to authorize without a second signature. Frank, visibly shaken, asked the question my father said hung over the whole room. How long have you known about this? Linda admitted she'd suspected discrepancies for over a year, but hadn't had concrete proof until the automated audit landed that very Saturday morning. Coincidentally, right as the police cars pulled onto our street. A board vote was called immediately, not about our wedding this time, but about Debbie's position itself. The motion to remove her as HOA president, effective immediately, pending a full financial investigation and formal referral to the county for the fabricated police report, passed 5-0. Even Rhonda, present by then, voted yes. My father called me with the news just as Andre and I were checking out of the hotel, and I had to sit down on the edge of the bed to absorb it fully, not triumph exactly, more a strange, quiet exhale, like a held breath finally released after an entire summer of holding it. The board also voted unanimously to formally apologize to our family in writing, to reimburse the wedding-related fines we'd paid over the summer for infractions the bylaws never actually supported, and to open an independent review of every other complaint Debbie had filed against residents during her 11 years as president. That review, it would turn out over the following weeks, uncovered a pattern stretching back years, disproportionate scrutiny, unequal enforcement, complaints that arrived faster and harsher against a small handful of families, almost always the same handful, almost always for reasons that dissolved the moment anyone actually examined them closely. The county, once notified about the false police report, opened its own inquiry separate from the HOA's internal one, requesting the responding officer's body cam footage and Debbie's original 911 call transcript, both of which, according to what Linda later confirmed, corroborated everything Renata's folder and Linda's recording had already shown. Debbie did not attend the emergency meeting, according to my father, though she'd clearly known it was happening. Instead, neighbors reported her car was gone from the driveway by Sunday afternoon, and her curtains, drawn tight since Saturday's ceremony, stayed that way for the better part of the following week entirely. The community bulletin board, once home to her laminated flyers and unsigned warnings, held a very different notice by Monday morning, an official HOA statement, signed by all 5 remaining board members, acknowledging a serious failure of leadership and committing to new safeguards against exactly the kind of selective enforcement we'd endured. Pam texted me a photo of that notice with the caption, "Look how the turntables." And despite everything, despite the exhaustion still sitting heavy in my bones, I laughed harder at that text than I had in weeks. Sitting in the passenger seat of Andre's car on our way back into town. Finally, truly married. Andre's firehouse crew, several of whom had attended the wedding in plain clothes, found out about the police involvement through the department grapevine and half-jokingly requested the incident report just to read it themselves. What they found, one of them told Andre later, was one of the most thoroughly documented false reports he'd seen in years. The responding lead officer, whose name we finally learned was Sergeant Dana Ruiz, submitted a formal note in the incident file recommending the department flag Debbie's address for pattern review, citing 3 prior non-emergency calls from the same number over the preceding 2 years, all involving residents of color, all ultimately unfounded. That detail landed heavy when I read it in the copy of the report we later requested. 3 prior calls. Not a single lapse in judgment on an emotional Saturday, but a pattern stretching back years. A habit dressed up as vigilance. A woman who had learned exactly which fears to perform for a dispatcher. The county prosecutor's office, reviewing the false report referral alongside the HOA financial findings, eventually charged Debbie with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor carrying, possible fines and community service, alongside a separate civil referral regarding the misappropriated HOA funds, which her attorney would spend the following months negotiating repayment for. None of this happened instantly, of course. Weeks passed, then months, filled with mediation sessions, financial repayment plans, and a quiet, humble Debbie who stopped attending block parties entirely, who trimmed her own lawn now without ever glancing at anyone else's, who nodded stiffly if she passed my parents on the street at all. My mother, to my genuine surprise, never gloated, not once, not even privately in our own kitchen. "I don't need her to suffer," she told me one evening. "I just needed her to stop." And she has. Slowly, that this had always been the difference between us and Debbie, we never wanted a war. The new HOA board, with Linda now serving as interim president until formal elections, sent every resident a revised enforcement policy within a month, requiring dual sign-off on any complaint, a mandatory response window, and an appeals process that hadn't existed before, built directly, though unspoken, in response to everything our family had endured. Mr. Unofficially, something like the neighborhood's conscience after that, the man who'd remembered the quinceañera, who'd spoken up when it mattered, who now sat on the newly formed review committee ensuring no other family would spend a summer defending their own backyard the way we had. Andre and I settled into married life slowly, the wedding album arriving 8 weeks later with a photo none of us had staged but all of us loved most. 4 police officers in the back row, hats in their laps, watching 2 people exchange rings under string lights, faces soft with something like hope restored. I framed that photo myself and hung it in our new apartment's hallway. Not as a trophy exactly, but as a reminder that cruelty dressed up as policy will eventually meet someone who reads the fine print, and that sometimes the very system weaponized against you turns out, when it works right, to be the thing that saves you. My father finally repainted the fence Debbie had once sent a letter about, the same shade it had always been, just fresher now, and planted a small magnolia sapling beside the pergola he'd built years earlier. Quiet, deliberate reclaiming of a name a neighborhood sign had always promised but rarely delivered for us. Linda called my mother one afternoon in the spring to let her know the financial repayment plan had been finalized. Every dollar of the misappropriated funds set for full restitution to the HOA over 18 months, and that the county case had resolved with a plea, fines, and a formal record neither of us would ever have to explain twice. Debbie sold her house that summer. Quietly. No goodbye party. No farewell notice on the bulletin board she used to control so completely. Pam texted me the listing photo with no caption at all, and I looked at it for a long moment before closing the message, feeling less triumph than I expected. Mostly just relief. A young couple moved into her old house that fall, and within their first month, Mr. Okafor brought them oranges from his tree the same way he'd once brought them to us, and told them, gently, exactly what kind of neighborhood he hoped Magnolia Ridge could keep becoming, now that it finally had the chance to. I think about that wedding day often. Not the sirens or the accusations, but the specific moment Sergeant Ruiz took off his hat and sat down in a folding chair he had every right to walk away from instead. That choice, small as it was, told me something about the world I needed badly to hear that year. Andre says the marriage certificate should have a footnote. Married under a tent, under police escort, under a magnolia tree planted the week after, and I laugh every time he says it, because it's true. Because our wedding day became a story neither of us ever expected but both of us somehow ended up proud of. My mother still hosts block parties in that backyard every summer. Bigger now, louder even, string lights strung the same way. And every neighbor comes, every single one, because the file Debbie once kept on our family has long since been replaced by something else entirely. An open gate, a full table, a name finally welcomed. Some nights I still pull out the folder. The one I built all summer out of screenshots and timestamps and a mother's stubborn refusal to move one flower. And I don't read it for anger anymore. Just as a record. Proof that patience and paperwork, in the end, can be their own quiet, devastating kind of justice. Renata still sends us a card every wedding anniversary. Always signed the same way. No laminated warnings required this year. I checked, and every year it makes Andre laugh so hard he has to read it twice. And every year I think about how close we came to letting one woman's cruelty steal our joy. Frank, the quiet board member who first asked about the quinceañera, later told my father over a fence-line conversation that he'd regretted staying silent for years before that meeting. That watching Debbie's own recording finally made the pattern impossible to unsee, and that he was sorry it had taken our wedding to force that reckoning. My father accepted the apology the way he accepts most things, with a nod and a handshake and no real need to dwell on it longer than necessary, because that has always been his way, not forgetting, never quite forgetting, but choosing, deliberately, not to let one woman's smallness define 18 years of building a home. The HOA newsletter, redesigned under Linda's leadership, ran a small feature that spring called Good Neighbors, profiling residents who'd gone out of their way to help others. Pam, Mr. Okafor, even Hector's tent crew, thanked publicly for their patience through what the article carefully called a difficult season for the community. I read that newsletter standing at our new kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, and felt something settle fully in my chest for maybe the first time since June of that summer. Not closure exactly. Closure feels too clean for something this messy, but something close enough to peace that I could finally stop bracing for the next letter. Andre framed the incident report alongside our wedding photo, an odd pairing that somehow made perfect sense in our hallway. Proof beside celebration, the cost beside the reward, a reminder that joy this hard-won deserves to be looked at fully, both the beautiful parts and the parts that nearly broke us along the way. My mother finally took down the folder of old HOA letters she'd kept in a kitchen drawer for 18 years, the fines and warnings and notices of concern, and replaced it with our wedding invitation instead, tucked into the same drawer, the same spot, a small private act of reclaiming what that drawer was for. I called Linda one last time that winter, just to thank her properly, and she told me something I've carried with me since, that she'd almost let the financial discrepancies go for another quarter, almost decided it wasn't worth the conflict, until she watched Debbie's confrontation with the police and understood, finally, exactly what she'd been protecting by staying quiet. Sometimes it takes watching someone's cruelty out loud, she said, to understand you've been enabling it in silence. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count since, not just about Debbie, but about every small warning sign we'd all learned, over 11 years, to quietly explain away instead of naming outright. Sergeant Ruiz sent a short note through the department months later, forwarded to us by Renata, who'd stayed in touch with him regarding the false report case, simply saying he was glad the wedding had gone forward as planned and that his daughter, seeing the photo, had asked if she could get married with a police escort too. Andre laughed for a full minute reading that note aloud, and I laughed with him, and for a moment the whole summer collapsed down into something almost sweet in the retelling, a story we could tell at future family dinners, softened by distance, though never softened enough to forget what it had actually cost us to survive it. My grandmother-in-law, back in Detroit now, still tells the story to anyone who'll listen, usually ending with the same line. That girl walked down her own aisle twice that day, and both times she walked it like a queen. I didn't feel much like a queen in the moment. I feel a little more like one now. Pam and I still meet for coffee most weekends, and she told me recently that she'd started keeping her own folder now, quietly, just in case, watching for the same patterns in a new HOA board member who reminds her a little too much of who Debbie used to be before any of us knew her true colors. I told Pam I hoped she'd never need that folder, but that I understood completely why she was building one anyway. Because some lessons, once learned this thoroughly, never really leave you. The instinct to document, to timestamp, to keep proof close, even in seasons when everything around you finally, blessedly, feels calm. Mr. away peacefully the following spring, and at his funeral, held 2 streets over from Willow Bend Court, half the neighborhood showed up, including several people who'd once stayed silent all summer rather than risk Debbie's attention. People who finally understood, a little late, exactly what kind of neighbor they'd lost. My mother spoke briefly at that funeral, mentioning the oranges, the quinceanera, the quiet courage of a man who'd chosen to speak up when speaking up cost him nothing but comfort, and I watched several people in that room look down at their hands, quietly recalculating who they wanted to be from that day forward. The magnolia sapling my father planted grew slower than expected that first year, stubborn against the autumn frost, and he tended it anyway, every single week. The same patient care he'd given that backyard for 18 years before a single flower ever bloomed in it, the way our wedding finally let it bloom. By the following autumn, 1 full year after the wedding, that sapling had grown nearly 2 feet, and my parents hosted an anniversary dinner beneath it. The same folding chairs, the same string lights, a smaller, quieter gathering this time. Just family, just the people who'd stood in that yard through every version of that summer. I stood under that tree with Andre, 1 year married, and thought about how strange it was that the worst day of that entire ordeal had also somehow become, in the retelling, the day I felt most certain of everything, of him, of my parents, of a community capable, eventually, of choosing better. The new HOA board, a full year in, held its annual meeting in that same beige conference room. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the meeting ran under an hour. No fabricated urgency, no laminated flyers, no families quietly bracing themselves for whatever letter might arrive next in their mailbox. Linda was formally elected president that meeting, unopposed, and gave a short speech afterward about the kind of neighborhood Magnolia Ridge was trying to become, one where the rules protected everyone equally, or protected no one at all, because a rulebook wielded selectively was never really a rulebook, just a weapon with better paperwork. I wasn't at that meeting, but my mother was, sitting quietly in the back row the way she always had, and she told me afterward that when Linda's speech ended, several neighbors turned to look at her specifically, an unspoken acknowledgement neither loud nor dramatic, just 18 years of patience finally, quietly, being seen. Andre and I bought our own house that following spring. 2 towns over. No HOA at all. A deliberate choice we made together after everything. Though we still spend most Sundays back on Willow Bend Court. The yard my parents built still the true center of gravity for every gathering our family holds. My mother's rose bushes climb even higher now along that trellis. And every summer she cuts a small bouquet for our kitchen table. A tradition she started the year after the wedding, a quiet ritual that never needs explaining between us, though we both know exactly what those flowers are actually standing in for. Sometimes I still see Sergeant Ruiz around town, off duty, and we always stop to talk for a few minutes, mostly about ordinary things now. His daughter's upcoming graduation, Andre's latest firehouse promotion, the specific strange kinship that grows between people who once stood together through something neither of them expected to survive. The wedding video, edited by a cousin who happened to catch most of it on her phone, Ends with a shot none of us noticed being filmed at the time. My father, mid-dance with me, glancing once toward Debbie's dark, silent house across the street, then turning back to me, smiling, choosing, deliberately, to look forward instead. I've watched that clip more times than I can count, and every time, it lands the same way, not as triumph over someone else's cruelty, but as proof of exactly what my family has always known how to do better than Debbie Whitfield ever managed in 11 years of trying. Choose joy, and keep choosing it, on purpose. 2 years to the day after our wedding, we hosted a small anniversary gathering in that same backyard, and halfway through the evening, Pam pulled me aside with news I genuinely hadn't expected. Debbie was back in town, staying temporarily with her son Tyler 2 neighborhoods over, and had asked, quietly, if she could speak with my mother. I felt my stomach drop hearing it, old instincts flaring instantly, the same tightening I used to feel every time an HOA envelope appeared in our mailbox. Andre squeezed my hand and asked what I wanted to do. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet, that some doors take longer to decide about than others. My mother, when I told her, didn't hesitate the way I expected her to. I'll hear what she has to say, she said simply. Hearing someone out costs me nothing. Trusting them again is a different question entirely, and one she hasn't earned an answer to yet. I admired her for that distinction more than I could say. Debbie came to the house 3 days later. Alone. Dressed plainly. None of the sharp confidence she used to carry like a second skin. My mother met her on the front porch. Not inside. A small, deliberate boundary that spoke volumes without a single word needing to explain it out loud to anyone watching. I watched from the kitchen window, close enough to hear, as Debbie apologized. Actually apologized. Not the careful non-apology she'd offered board members years earlier, but something that sounded, for once, genuinely humbled. She mentioned therapy, mandated partly by her plea agreement, and said she'd spent 2 years trying to understand why she'd done what she did. I told myself it was about rules, she said, voice unsteady. It was never about rules. I know that now. Forgive me. I just needed you to know I finally see it. My mother listened without interrupting. Arms crossed loosely. Face unreadable in the particular way she reserves for moments that matter most. When Debbie finished, my mother was quiet for a long moment before responding. I appreciate you saying that, she said finally. It doesn't undo what it cost my daughter, or this family, or the people you targeted before us. But I hope, genuinely, that you keep doing the work that got you to finally saying it. Debbie nodded, eyes wet, and didn't ask for anything more than that. No invitation inside. No reconciliation dinner. No pretense that 18 years of quiet harm could be smoothed over by one porch conversation. She simply thanked my mother, turned, and walked back down the driveway toward her son's waiting car parked at the curb. I found my mother afterward sitting on the back patio, watching the magnolia sapling, now taller than either of us, sway gently in the evening breeze. How do you feel? I asked. She thought about it for a while before answering. Lighter, she finally said. Not because of her. I sat down beside her, and for a long while neither of us said anything else. Just watched the tree my father planted grow slightly more real in the dimming light. A small, stubborn, living thing that had somehow outlasted every letter, every flyer, every siren, every single thing Debbie Whitfield had ever tried to plant instead. The following spring, an anonymous letter arrived at the HOA office, forwarded eventually to Linda, describing yet another pattern of selective enforcement, this time from a newer board member who'd quietly resumed some of Debbie's old habits, targeting a young interracial couple 2 streets over with sudden, unexplained noise complaints about their toddler's birthday party. Linda called an emergency review the moment she read it, remembering exactly how quickly small warnings could calcify into something far worse if nobody intervened early enough. And this time, armed with the new dual sign-off policy and the appeals process built directly from our own summer's hard lessons, the board moved within a single week. The offending board member was formally reprimanded, the complaint dismissed as unfounded, and the young couple received a written apology within days rather than months. A timeline that would have seemed impossible to imagine back when our own family had spent an entire summer fighting for the exact same basic fairness. Pam texted me the news with the caption, "The system actually worked this time." In real time, imagine that, and I sat with that message for a long while, feeling something complicated but ultimately hopeful. Proof that the changes born out of our worst summer were now quietly protecting families who'd never even know our names. I called the young couple myself, unprompted, just to offer support and, if they wanted it, the same folder-building advice that had carried my own family through months of documentation. The wife cried on the phone, relieved mostly, and said she hadn't realized until that moment that anyone else in the neighborhood had faced something similar before her. "You're not the first," I told her gently. "And because of what happened to us, you won't be treated the way we almost were." It felt strange saying those words out loud. Strange and good in equal measure. Like watching a scar finally do something useful instead of simply aching whenever the weather changed around it. That autumn, 3 years after our wedding, Linda invited our family to speak briefly at the HOA's annual meeting, not about Debbie specifically, but about the broader lessons the community had learned regarding fairness, documentation, and the quiet dangers of letting one person hold unchecked power over people's basic right to celebrate their own lives. My mother spoke for exactly 4 minutes. No notes. Describing 18 years of small letters that had eventually built toward one impossible summer, and ending with a line that made half the room go still. A rulebook only means something if it protects everyone the same way. Otherwise, it's just a very polite kind of cruelty. The room applauded longer than any HOA meeting applause I'd ever witnessed. And afterward, 3 separate families approached my mother privately, describing their own small, quiet histories of unequal treatment they'd never felt safe enough to name out loud before hearing someone else finally say it first. Clearly, calmly, without apology. Andre and I still light the string lights along that pergola every anniversary. A small private tradition now, just the 2 of us most years, sitting beneath the same trellis where we said our vows through sirens, surrounded by the same roses, the same magnolia tree grown tall enough now to cast real shade over the patio. I think, most years on that anniversary evening, about the version of that day that could have happened instead. The wedding quietly moved to a rented hall, the fight abandoned, the yard left ordinary, untouched by any of what it eventually came to mean. I'm endlessly grateful my mother refused to let that version happen, Because the truth is, that yard isn't just where we got married anymore. It's where a family's patience finally outlasted someone else's cruelty in front of witnesses who couldn't look away. Where a system built to protect the wrong kind of power got forced, publicly and permanently, into protecting something better instead. Debbie moved out of the area entirely the following year. According to Pam's last update, somewhere upstate, quiet, unremarkable, no longer anyone's HOA president. No longer anyone's cautionary tale except in the story our family still tells. Gently now, less about her cruelty than about everything we built in spite of it. My father still tends that magnolia tree every single week. Rain or shine, the same patient devotion he gave that backyard for 18 years before it ever had the chance to become what it eventually became. He doesn't talk about that summer much anymore. He doesn't really need to. I keep the folder still, tucked in a drawer in our own house now, not out of anger, not anymore, but as a kind of inheritance, proof for whoever comes next in. Our family, that documentation matters, that patience matters, that sometimes the quietest kind of resistance is simply refusing to stop showing up as yourself. Renata still coordinates weddings across the region, and tells me she keeps a version of our story in her back pocket for exactly the couples who need to hear it. Proof that even the worst kind of interference can be met calmly, thoroughly, with nothing more dramatic than good paperwork and people who refuse to back down. Sergeant Ruiz retired last year after 22 years on the force, and Andre attended his retirement dinner, where Ruiz apparently told the whole room, unprompted, about the wedding he'd once crashed with sirens and left as an honored guest, calling it, in his own words, the best worst call I ever responded to. I laughed reading Andre's text about that speech, sitting in our kitchen with coffee going cold, thinking about how strange it is that a single Saturday afternoon 3 years ago has quietly threaded itself through so many other people's lives since then. A retirement speech, a young couple's saved birthday party, my own mother's 4 minutes at a podium. None of it undoes the summer it cost us to get there. I want to be honest about that. Even now, even with everything that eventually came right in the end. There were nights that August I cried harder than I'd cried since childhood. Certain the wedding, maybe even the neighborhood, would break something in my family permanently, but it didn't break us. Slowly, painfully, and then it revealed Debbie too, in exactly the same light. And in the space between those two revelations, something better than either of us expected got built. Not just a marriage, though certainly that, but a small, stubborn proof that decency, documented and defended, tends to outlast cruelty eventually. My mother says it best. Usually over dinner when someone asks about that summer, the way people still occasionally do at family gatherings. We didn't win because we were angrier than her, she says. We won because we kept showing up as exactly who we already were. And eventually, everyone else could finally see the difference clearly. I think about Mr. Wishing he could have seen how far things eventually went. The policy changes, the young couple protected within a week, the magnolia tree now taller than my father. I like to think he'd approve, quietly, the way he approved of most things, with an orange from his tree and a knowing nod. Andre's grandmother, still in Detroit, still tells the story at every family holiday. And every year the sirens get a little louder in her retelling. The officers a little more heroic. The whole thing slightly more legendary than it actually was in the moment. Though honestly, looking back, it barely needs the embellishment at all. I got a message last month from the young interracial couple whose birthday party complaint had been dismissed so quickly, letting me know they just had their own wedding. Backyard. Small. Intimate. Fully permitted from the very first week of planning. No delays. No laminated flyers. No sirens interrupting a single moment of their joy. I cried reading that message. The good kind of crying. The kind that arrives when you realize something painful you survived actually protected someone else from having to survive the same thing at all. That, more than anything else, more than any apology or any resignation, felt like the truest ending our story could have gotten. Because in the end, this was never really just about one wedding, or one Karen, or one summer of laminated warnings and false police reports. It was about what a family chooses to do when someone with a little borrowed authority decides your joy is a threat worth calling in reinforcements against. Again and again, we chose to document. We chose, even in our angriest, most exhausted moments, not to become the hostile crowd Debbie insisted we already were. And in the end, that choice, quiet, stubborn, utterly unglamorous, turned out to be the twist nobody, including Debbie, ever saw coming that Saturday afternoon. The sirens that once terrified me on my own wedding day now mean something different entirely when I hear them from a distance. Not dread. Not the old tightening in my chest. But a strange, quiet reminder that sometimes the very systems people try to weaponize against you end up, eventually, standing exactly where you needed them to. My daughter, because yes, we have one now, born the spring after our second anniversary, will grow up hearing this story the way I grew up hearing my parents' stories about. Moving into Magnolia Ridge 18 years before she was born. Another link in a family chain built on patience, documentation, and roses that always, eventually, bloom. We named her Grace. Not for any dramatic reason, just because it felt right, though my mother likes to joke that it also happens to be the exact thing Debbie Whitfield never once managed to extend to us, and the exact thing our family somehow found the strength to extend back to her anyway. Eventually, on that porch, Grace will grow up in a neighborhood, though a different one than mine, and I hope, more than almost anything else, that if she ever faces her own version of Debbie Whitfield, she'll remember this story and know instinctively what my mother always knew. That dignity, documented and defended calmly, outlasts almost anything thrown against it. The magnolia tree in my parents' backyard is fully grown now, casting real shade over the patio where Grace has already had 2 birthday parties of her own. Fully permitted, fully welcomed, fully ordinary in exactly the way our own wedding almost wasn't allowed to be. Back before an entire community learned better. Together, the hard way. Linda still serves as HOA president. Re-elected twice now. And every year at the annual meeting she mentions, briefly, the summer that changed how Magnolia Ridge operates. Not to shame anyone still living there, but to remind every new resident exactly what kind of neighborhood they've chosen, and exactly what kind it's still actively trying to become. I drove past Debbie's old house last week, now home to that young couple's growing family. Decorations up early for a birthday party spilling cheerfully across the front lawn. No laminated warnings anywhere in sight. And felt, watching it, something I hadn't expected to feel about that particular house ever again. Simple, uncomplicated peace. Andre asked me recently if I'd do anything differently, looking back at that whole exhausting summer, and I thought about it seriously before answering. I wouldn't change the fight. I might have started documenting even earlier. But I wouldn't trade a single moment of walking that aisle twice. Once in fear. Once completely, finally free. Because that's the part people forget when they hear the dramatic version of our story. The sirens, the audit, the resignation, the charges. They forget the quieter part. The part that actually mattered most. 80 people sitting patiently in folding chairs, refusing to leave, waiting for us to finish what Debbie tried so hard to interrupt. That patience, more than any policy change or any criminal charge, is what I think about most now, years later. A whole yard full of people who simply refused to let one woman's cruelty become the story of that day. Who sat quietly through sirens and accusations and waited, simply, for love to be allowed to continue. Sergeant Ruiz's daughter did end up getting married the following year. And true to the note he'd sent us, she asked for a small police escort as part of the ceremony. A tradition her father now jokes he accidentally started standing in our backyard, hat in his lap, watching two strangers become a family right in front of him. I like knowing that. Whatever Debbie meant to destroy that Saturday afternoon, whatever fear or control or resentment drove her to call those sirens down on our joy, it ended up, instead, becoming a small, strange tradition of tenderness in at least one other family's life entirely by accident. That's the twist I keep coming back to. The one I don't think Debbie ever understood even after everything. That cruelty, when it fails loudly enough, in front of enough witnesses, doesn't just get corrected. Sometimes it gets transformed into something the opposite of what it intended. Something warmer. Something that outlives the original harm completely. My mother's rose bushes bloomed especially full this past spring, climbing higher along that trellis than they ever had before, and she cut an enormous bouquet for Grace's second birthday party, setting it right in the center of the same table where wedding programs once sat stacked, waiting for a ceremony almost derailed by sirens. I watched Grace toddle across that same grass where I once walked down an aisle twice, laughing at something only she found funny, utterly unaware of everything that yard had survived to become simply, finally, ordinary again, just a backyard, just a family, just roses climbing a trellis my father built with his own two hands. And maybe that's the real ending. The one that matters more than any headline about a fired HOA president or a misdemeanor charge or an audit that finally caught up to years of quiet theft. The real ending is just this. A yard full of people who love each other, undisturbed. Finally, completely undisturbed. Andre pulled me aside during Grace's party and nodded toward the magnolia tree. Taller now than either of us. Its branches finally wide enough to cast shade over half the patio. Good bones, he said, echoing his grandmother's words from years earlier. This yard always had good bones. It just needed the chance to prove it. I think about Debbie sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, and I don't feel the anger anymore that used to arrive automatically with her name. Mostly I just feel a kind of tired clarity, that fear, weaponized against joy, will always eventually meet its match in people patient enough to keep documenting, keep showing up, keep choosing love anyway. The county eventually closed its case against Debbie Foley that following winter. Restitution paid in full 18 months after the audit. Community service completed at a food bank 2 towns over. According to the final court notice, Linda forwarded us out of courtesy. Not obligation. Simply because she knew we'd want the closure of an ending. I read that final notice standing in my own kitchen. Grace asleep upstairs. Andre reading beside me on the couch. And felt, for the first time in years, like the story genuinely had an ending now. Not just a pause between chapters, but an actual, quiet, unremarkable conclusion to something that had once felt endless. Debbie sent one final letter that winter, addressed to my mother specifically, not asking for anything, not defending anything, just a short note thanking her for the porch conversation years earlier, and mentioning that she now volunteered weekly at a community mediation center, trying, in her words, to be useful in a way I never was before. My mother read that letter twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the same kitchen drawer where our wedding invitation now lived. Not as forgiveness exactly, but as a kind of closing, a final page in a story that had taken up far too much space in our lives for far too long already. People can change, my mother told me that evening, watching Grace nap on the couch. I don't know if she really has, but I know we don't have to carry the question anymore. We got our answer the day we finished that ceremony. Sirens and all. Everything since then has just been the world catching up. I think that's the truest thing anyone said through this entire story. 3 years and 1 daughter and 1 magnolia tree later. We got our answer that Saturday afternoon, standing in folding chairs, refusing to let fear write the ending. Everything since then really has just been the world. Slowly, imperfectly, finally catching up to us. Pam still lives across the street. Still texts me photos of the neighborhood's small, ordinary dramas. A stray cat, a new mailbox. Nothing that ever again rises to the level of sirens or laminated flyers. Boring is beautiful, she texted last month. And I sent back a photo of Grace asleep beneath the magnolia tree in agreement. Renata booked her 300th wedding last spring and sent me a photo from the venue with the caption, "No permits disputed. No police involved, but I always keep the folder ready just in case." I laughed reading it, grateful beyond words that our worst day had somehow become someone else's professional preparedness instead of a warning. The HOA newsletter ran another feature this spring. This time about the magnolia tree itself. Now the unofficial symbol of the neighborhood's slow, hard-won turn toward something better. A small plaque at its base reading simply, "Planted in patience. Grown in fairness." My father cried reading that plaque the day it was installed. I asked him why. Watching him wipe his eyes at the base of a tree he'd planted with his own hands years earlier. And he just shook his head and said, 18 years I waited for this neighborhood to see us the way we always saw ourselves. I didn't think a tree would be the thing that finally did it. Grace will plant her own tree there someday. My mother says, some small sapling beside the magnolia, a tradition she wants to start for every grandchild born into this family. A living record stretching backward and forward at once. Roots and branches, proof and promise, growing steadily out of ground that once held nothing but conflict. I still keep the folder, still add to it occasionally, not out of fear anymore but out of habit. A small stubborn ritual that reminds me, every time I open that drawer, exactly how far patience and documentation carried a family through the worst summer we ever lived. Together, side by side, refusing to break. Andre says our story should be a lesson taught somewhere. In some class, to some future homeowner nervously filling out their first special event permit. I tell him it already is. Quietly, informally, every time Pam tells a new neighbor about the summer the sirens came and stayed for exactly the right reason instead of the wrong one, because that's ultimately what this story became. 3 years and 1 wedding and 1 daughter and 1 grown magnolia tree later. Not a story about a Karen who lost her power, though certainly that too, but a story about a family who never once stopped being exactly who they already were. Through every single letter, every single flyer, every single siren. And in the end, that's the twist worth remembering most. The one bigger than any audit or any resignation or any charge, that the loudest, most desperate attempt to make us small only ever succeeded in showing the whole neighborhood exactly how large, how steady, how thoroughly undeniable our family had been all along. My mother still hosts block parties every summer, bigger now than ever, and this year, for the first time, Linda brought a new sapling as a gift, a second magnolia to plant beside the first. For the next family this yard gets to protect, she said. And my mother cried, and so did I, watching her plant it. Grace helped pat the dirt down around that second sapling's roots. 3 years old now, utterly unaware of everything that yard had survived to become the place she'll grow up thinking of simply as home, not a battlefield, not a courtroom, not a stage for someone else's cruelty. Just home. Exactly as it always should have been. I watched her small hands press into that soil and thought about every letter, every fine, every laminated flyer, every siren, every single thing this family absorbed, so that a 3-year-old could someday pat dirt around a tree without knowing any of it, without carrying any of the weight we carried to make that possible for her. That, I think, is the real hearsay-proof victory nobody puts in the incident report or the audit findings. Not the resignation, not the charges, not even the apology on the porch, but a little girl growing up in a backyard finally, completely free of everything her grandparents endured just to be allowed to celebrate a wedding there. Andre pulled me close that afternoon, watching Grace and my mother pack the soil together, and said quietly, "We did it. Not just the wedding." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, watching 2 magnolia trees stand side by side in the late afternoon light. Roots finally, permanently, unshakably at home. The county officially designated our street a model community the following year, part of some regional program recognizing fair housing enforcement improvements. And Linda accepted the small plaque at a ceremony none of us had expected to attend, though we did, standing together beneath both magnolia trees as the mayor read the citation aloud. Life since then has mostly been wonderfully, blessedly ordinary: birthday parties, block parties, Sunday dinners, Grace's first day of preschool, Andre's promotion, my own transfer to a pediatric unit I'd been hoping to join for years. The story of that wedding rarely comes up anymore except when someone new to the neighborhood finally asks about it. When they do ask, My mother tells it plainly now, without much drama, mostly focused on the parts that mattered: patience, documentation, a community that eventually chose better, a marriage that survived sirens and came out stronger for having to. She always ends the same way. It was hard, she says. And it was worth it. I've come to believe that's the truest way to tell this story, without the dramatic flourishes it probably deserves, without the villain monologues or the triumphant music, just a family who refused to be moved, a neighborhood that eventually caught up to decency, and a magnolia tree that grew tall enough, finally, to prove it. Debbie's name rarely comes up in our house anymore. Not out of avoidance. Just naturally. The way old storms stop being the thing you talk about once the sky's been clear for years. When it does come up, usually from a curious neighbor, my mother simply says, "She learned. Late, but she learned." That's enough for me. I think that's the hardest, most generous truth in this whole story, that justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it just looks like consequences finally landing where they were always supposed to, and a family choosing, deliberately, not to let bitterness take root in soil they'd worked far too hard to keep beautiful. Our folder sits in that kitchen drawer still, beside the wedding invitation, beside Debbie's final letter, beside Grace's preschool artwork now too, an unlikely collection of proof and celebration living side by side, a small, ordinary drawer holding an entire family's hardest, most important lesson about patience, documentation, and the cost of refusing to disappear. Every summer now, string lights go back up along that pergola, roses climb higher along the same trellis, and 2 magnolia trees cast wider shade over a backyard that once nearly broke under the weight of one woman's cruelty and instead became, slowly, stubbornly, the most beautiful place our family has ever built together. Grace will grow up under those trees not knowing sirens once interrupted a wedding there, only knowing laughter, birthday cake, her grandmother's roses, and a home finally, completely free to simply exist without permission from anyone who never deserved the power to withhold it in the first place. That, more than anything, is the ending we fought for. Andre and I still slow dance under those string lights every anniversary, in the exact spot where sirens once drowned out our vows. And every year the silence afterward feels a little more permanent, a little more ours. Proof that joy, patient enough and stubborn enough, always finds its way back to the yard it was always meant for. The END.